The white scarf was a strip torn from a summer blouse, knotted to a stick that once held a radio aerial. It moved like a tired flag above two women in feld-grouse skirts climbing from a hedgerow southeast of Bad Aibling on the 14th of May 1945. Pine pitched in the warming air, coal smoke climbed from a far chimney. Somewhere a cowbell kept slow time. They expected a firing line. What waited instead was a canteen line scented with grilled beef. An American military policeman stood with his palm open, fingers steady, an M1 Garand slung muzzle down so its bright steel warned without shouting. Beyond him, a GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo truck idled with the patience of an ox. Bumper codes chalked in crisp white, barbed wire strung between pickets casting piano key shadows. Aussteigen, the MP called, New York in his vowels. The women stepped. Lieselotte Hartmann, 21, Luftwaffe Signals Auxiliary, felt rules surge like muscle memory. Turn out pockets, step where told, say as little as necessary. She noted the sergeant's stripes, the web gear riding his hips, the way the Garand's muzzle kissed his boot. He gestured them forward. A board behind him promised hamburgers today in stout letters. Beside it, a cap lifter hung on a nail like a small guarantee that things would open when asked. Processing moved the way machines breathe. A medic lifted eyelids, checked lice, dabbed tincture along the collar. A clerk took names, units, birth towns. The powder from the delousing pump rose in puffs and settled like chalk on lashes. A Red Cross worker, American, hair tucked tight, sleeves rolled, said her name was Ruth. Her German was careful, schoolroom plain. You will receive coupons for work. Canteen purchases allowed, limited quantities, she recited, tilting a paper so the inked boxes caught light. Coupons, labour, purchase. Ordinary words that felt impossible under barbed wire. Lieselotte tried to remember the last time she had eaten butter. The memory offered only a grey cube shining like candle fat. The smell from the grill called to her in a language older than flags. On the table, a sheet marked Canteen Prices listed items in block letters. Coca-Cola 5 cents, chocolate 5 to 10 cents, soap 10 cents, ice cream 5 cents when available. 5 cents wherever he is, Ruth said. Doctrine made price tag. The MP nodded them through a rough-cut gate. One at a time, he said, soft voice, set jaw. The barbs were clean. Floodlights waited, not menacing as prepared. The path to the canteen ran along crushed stone and a ditch where frogs would wake later. A quartermaster corporal hauled a crate of bottles from the CCKW. Glass knocked glass in a friendly clatter. Wet stencils on the crate ends told a story of rain and road dust. The truck's hood steamed faintly like an animal after work. Hamburger? Ruth asked, palm open the way the MP's had been. Lieselotte nodded, not trusting her voice. The cook lifted a patty with a flat spatula. Fat hissed where it met hot metal. The bun looked absurdly large, and yet the hand that steadied it made it ordinary. Ruth reached for a bottle, pinched the cap lifter, and made a small promise to physics. The cap flicked off with a neat hiss and a bell-like clink against the nail. Cold glass sweated in Lieselotte's hand. She tipped it carefully until caramel fizz met her tongue. This was not magnanimity, it was procedure. The 1929 Geneva Convention's articles on rations and canteens were pinned to the notice board in 2 languages. Rations equivalent to depot troops. Canteens installed where prisoners could obtain foodstuffs at local prices. Purchase limits to prevent hoarding. Work details assigned by need and capacity. Dry words, but their consequence in the mouth was unmistakable. If the enemy could afford mercy by regulation, what else could they afford? Lieselotte took the first bite. Bread gave, meat surrendered a clean edge of salt and smoke. It felt indecent to taste this in defeat, and yet the world did not punish her for it. Over her shoulder the CCKW clicked as it cooled. Somewhere out of sight, a truck backfired and a man laughed. Ruth asked if the bottle was acceptable. Lieselotte nodded and kept the cap, sliding it into her skirt pocket the way one might keep a relic for proof. She had expected humiliation measured in wounds and shouting. Instead, she found order measured in coupons and schedules. Defeat had arrived not as a boot, but as a ledger balanced to the penny. She did not yet have language for it. She had only this: the smell of pine after a wet spring, the sun on glass, the sound of caps singing off bottles in a rhythm that, for the first time in a long while, sounded like a future. They filed under a timber lintel scabbed with nail heads into the intake shed that smelled of carbolic and wool. Numbers swallowed names. A clerk with a carbon pad asked for family names, maiden names, birth towns, units. The pencil nicked the paper each time someone hesitated. The delousing pump worked in short bursts, powder skipping from shoulders to collars. A medic's hand checked hairlines with a practiced tenderness that felt like a habit more than a mercy. The Seventh Army had learned, by hard practice, to turn chaos into ledger lines. A notice board in both languages, rations equivalent to depot troops per the 1929 Geneva Convention, canteens to be installed where prisoners may buy foodstuffs at local prices, work details assigned by skill and health, wages credited as camp coupons. None of this was a kindness. It was a system tuned to keep order with the least waste. A Red Cross worker with a second-hand teacher's patience, Ruth, simply Ruth, read the rules into German that did not forgive imprecision. Purchase limits kept markets steady. Soap was scarce but present. Chocolate sold in small squares. Coca-Cola at 5 cents a bottle. Here, now, behind wire. Lieselotte glanced at the 8-ounce curves of the glass and remembered ration lines in Rosenheim. The medical sergeant swabbed arms and lifted chins. He used the language of checklists, not reprimand. Temperature adequate, lice negative, nutritional deficit present, and the mess officer would bump fat and sugar forward for 3 days. A good army stayed boring on purpose. Boredom kept the lid on. Outside, the weather turned bright enough to make metal sing. A GMC CCKW stood over crushed stone, hood open an inch to let heat sigh out. A corporal wiped his hands on a rag and counted cases with a grease pencil, wetting the tip every 10 tallies. The chalked bumper codes read like liturgy: unit, company, vehicle number, convoy serial. He had delivered ammunition the week before and flour the week after. The truck liked miles. He palmed the hood latch with care. Labour assignments posted at 1600, Ruth said, pinning a new sheet with a stubby nail. If you have kitchen experience, identify yourself. If you have farm experience, likewise. If you were in signals, the engineers might ask you to coil wire or check insulation. No one works beyond capacity. The tone might have sounded patronising except for the math of it. A camp ran on schedules the way a factory ran on belts. Men with carbines paced the wire, keeping time. At the canteen window, a corporal in quartermaster khaki took coupon books from the first wave of prisoners and returned change in small rectangles the colour of dust. Chocolate was rationed to 1 square. Cigarettes, when present, were locked behind a screen and sold by the pack to prevent barter from swallowing discipline. The Coca-Cola crate glittered under condensation. Someone joked the bottles looked like church windows. Lieselotte counted her coupons twice. She did not yet trust the arithmetic of mercy. Ruth answered 3 sharp questions from a grey-haired auxiliary. Afterward she said fairness had to be enforced like a guard shift. A young MP, Morales, checked his M1 carbine's safety and nodded to open the side hatch. Procedure nested into procedure until the day felt padded, safe, because the rules were busy on everyone's behalf. When the first shift reported to the kitchen, Lieselotte followed the smell of onions to a room where a field range sat like a metal altar, legs braced, firebox bright. The mess sergeant taught them how the burner grates lifted, how grease would be trapped and collected. He said the range could boil 100 quarts. He had numbers to prove it, and numbers were a dialect everyone here would learn. The sun dropped behind the ridge with a carpenter's tap. Along the fence line, the day's notices curled a little at the edges. Someone cinched the gas caps on the CCKW and patted the fender like a horse. A woman laughed at something ordinary. Liselotte realized the camp had not so much tamed her as absorbed her into its pulse. The bell for lights out would come, and then the tall lamps would hum, and then the night would belong to schedules. She folded her coupon book and slipped it into her blouse like a passport home. The chalk letters on the board were plain enough, Hamburgers today, but the smell wrote a longer sentence. Grease snapped where it met hot iron, onions softened to sweetness, a faint pepper rode the steam and made Liselotte's mouth water in a way that felt like trespass. She kept her place in the queue and imagined field telephones clicking. Procedure spoke softly. Ruth worked the counter like a motor pool. She set the bun on waxed paper, pressed a patty to test the spring, flicked a glance at the field range's pressure gauge like a pilot checking manifold heat. "First time?" she asked softly. Liselotte nodded. Ruth turned the cap lifter on its nail and made the ritual hiss. The bottle looked like 8 ounces of lake glass in her hand, the shoulder catching light. 5 cents, the sign insisted, the same price a private would pay anywhere. The quartermaster corporal stacked empty crates into a geometry that would ride well. He told the cook the CCKW could carry 5,000 pounds and still take ruts. Nearly 518,000 had been accepted by the army. Liselotte tried to imagine that and failed. She pictured one truck's road, depots of rubber and rope, bridges that seemed to lighten loads. She bit into the hamburger and felt the meat give and the bun collapse and something in her ribcage loosen too. American bread had a softness German bakers would have called childish. Today it tasted like forgiveness. Ruth set a thin square of chocolate on the waxed paper like a receipt. "Ice cream when available," she said. "Not always. But Coca-Cola. Nearly always." She smiled as if the system had lifted the weight already. Facts hung on the walls like ladles. The Geneva text in German and English said rations were to be equivalent to depot troops, canteens were to be installed, purchases would be limited by reasonable rules. Another notice explained coupon pay. Most prisoners would earn around 80 cents a day in camp scrip for soap, candy and soft drinks. Men with carbines held up their end by being visible, professional. Someone told a story from the railhead of a German at Fort Lewis who had stood at a counter like this, unable to choose between ice cream and Coca-Cola and so buying both. Liselotte believed it now. The story felt less like propaganda than like a photograph you hadn't seen yet. She had never tasted Coca-Cola in Germany. Wartime had shrunken shelves until memory felt rationed. Here the bottle sweated on her palm and asked no questions. The impossible number in the room was not the price, but the reach. By 1945, the company ran roughly 64 overseas bottling plants. Through the PX system, Coca-Cola held about 95% of soft drink share among US forces overseas. Billions of servings moved with the armies. A nickel drink could ride a Liberty ship, a convoy and a handcart, then land sweating on a table behind wire without losing a penny. The cook set another patty down with a steady hand. Buns arrived in paper stamped with a mill name from a town she could not place. The ketchup tasted of tomatoes and sugar. Ruth explained purchase caps kept the canteen from turning into a market. The idea was order. Soap would be available after the convoy came in. Cigarettes, when present, would be sold by the pack to keep barter in check. Outside, the CCKW ticked as it cooled, releasing smells of hot paint and dust. A mechanic slid under the frame and came out with grease on his cheek. He thumped the tyre and called the air pressure. The corporal wrote it on a tag without looking. Their language was cargo and miles. Liselotte's language, for the moment, was hunger answering plenty. When she finished the bottle, she turned the cap over in her hand. Teeth marks showed where the opener had gripped the ridges. She slipped it into her pocket the way one might keep a relic for proof. A bell rang somewhere, shift for the work detail forming at the gate, and the line behind her moved 3 inches. She stepped aside and thanked Ruth in German that sounded smaller than the moment. If this was defeat, it had a flavour. If mercy, a ledger. She felt something unclench that propaganda had kept tight for years. The smell of pine sharpened, the floodlights along the fence clicked as they warmed for evening. Behind her, the quartermaster man counted cases, 30, 60, 90, numbers like promises. She breathed, and for the first time since the surrender, she was not counting exits. She was counting bottles. Dawn slid under the canvas like an order. T/4. Joe DeLuca ran a hand along the CCKW's sideboard and felt road dust grind under his palm, a thin ledger of everywhere the truck had been. The motor said ready in a low, even note. Bumper codes, white on olive drab, spelled the convoy's math, and Joe read them the way a chaplain reads liturgy. Ahead, the lead truck rolled. He climbed in, checked the mirror, and rolled. Convoy doctrine was simple because it had to be. Interval, speed, then a halt to check fuel, canvas, lashings. A shed strap could shed a day's work. A grease pencil behind his ear for case counts, tyre notes, the little arithmetic that kept the big arithmetic honest. The radio crackled with call signs. The driver next over had a coffee can wired to the dash for bolts and luck. Soldiers waved from a ditch where engineers had left fresh fill. In the bed, crates did not think. Some held canned beef, some held flour in cloth sacks, some held 8-ounce bottles in block separators. £5,000 was the working number. If the road demanded, the CCKW would give more, but the manual liked 5. Manuals turned doubt into checklists. Checklists made miles. They rolled past a bridge shored with Bailey sections punched by factories that never slept. On the far bank, a depot waited with a smell Joe could inventory: oil, rope, paper, dust, coffee, a breath of chlorine from the water tank. A corporal with a clipboard met them at the dock and pointed with the economy of experience. He said the cases, the times, the needs. The corporal nodded. The bottling truck arrived. The driver hauled a hose, a rack of crowns, and a stainless tank polished by wind. "Top off run," he said. PX wanted every unit centred on the map. Design. A nickel drink had to work like a promise, or the promise would break. Joe walked the warehouse, marked stacks that had gotten sloppy. He liked aisles, straight as a parade ground, and pallets square on their chalk rectangles. Forks beeped, men cussed, a clerk counted with his lips, and the place ran like a metronome. The quartermaster lived for predictable hunger and scheduled thirst. Boredom was a weapon, and this was an armory. He found Ruth at the receiving window, translating purchase rules with the calm of a paymaster. She pointed to the sign. Parity rations were law. Coupon pay made small luxuries possible. He offered a ledger. She signed. People who believed in signs saved you explanations. He liked that. Back on the yard, a mechanic slid under a rear axle and called out air pressure. Joe repeated it to taste the certainty. He patted the sideboard like a horse. The truck did not care what it hauled. Ammunition 1 week, flour the next, Coke crowns the next. Service intervals came up like holidays. Keep them or pay. He checked the spare, the jack, the tool roll, and thought how a CCKW was a decision made 500,000 times and delivered on wheels. They left the depot lighter of worry and heavier of cargo. The road back ran through a village where women watched with expressions Joe could not inventory. He tipped his cap. The motor hummed, the cases knocked like teeth in a laugh. He kept interval and speed and pictured a belt around a pulley in a stateside factory, pulling everyone forward. At the camp, MPs waved them in, and the canteen man counted cases into his ledger. 30, 60, 90. The cook opened a crate of buns and breathed like a man who trusted breakfast. Joe signed and tucked his copy with a motion that felt like a salute. He looked toward the fence and saw two women slip past each other with the careful politeness of people learning not to be afraid. He did not tell anyone the thing he believed most. Mercy travelled by truck the same way ammunition did. He believed in miles more than speeches, in grease more than oaths, and in keeping a nickel, so a prisoner's first cold bottle cost no quarrel. The sun went higher and flattened shadows. For a moment, every truck in the yard looked like a fact you could live inside. The sign went up before lunch, corners pinned with tacks punched flat by rifle butts. Ruth smoothed it with the back of her hand until the wrinkles thought better of themselves. The German text sat alongside the English, rations equivalent to depot troops, canteens installed, purchase limits reasonable, work details matching skill and health, wages credited as coupons. She stood on a crate so her voice would carry and read as if the words were an oath. She explained how parity actually tasted. The mess would match depot calories, fats would step up for those flagged by the medic. Sugar would be pushed forward when tempers frayed, coffee would be coffee. She pointed to the price list already gossip, Coca-Cola 5 cents a bottle, chocolate in squares, soap rationed but available, ice cream when supplies allowed. A schedule, she said, held more kindness than speeches because it kept its promises on time. Lieselotte listened to the facts assemble into a life and hid relief. She had been trained to distrust the soft click of courtesy. Here courtesy travelled by schedule. "What about pay?" a grey-haired auxiliary asked, chin raised. "Coupons," Ruth said. "Typically 80 cents a day for work. Kitchen, farm, sanitation, wire." She flipped a coupon book to show the rectangles like postage. The guards were visible. Weapons looked kept, not brandished. Morales stood a few paces off, M1 carbine resting against his thigh, safety set with practiced thumb. He had learned that posture from a staff sergeant who said a guard's job was to be present, not theatrical. Presence made stupid ideas expensive. He walked the perimeter and watched for the moment when the schedule stopped feeling inevitable. Nothing suggested today would misbehave. The canteen window opened. The quartermaster corporal began his recitation. Purchase limits posted. 1 chocolate square per person, cigarettes by the pack only, soap to be signed for, bottles to be returned. The nickel price bound everyone to the same small fact. A private could pay a nickel, a prisoner could pay a nickel. Fairness at scale kept tempers smooth. Sameness was easier to defend than exceptions. Ruth wrote times on a slate. Kitchen shift sign up at 1600, work details muster at dawn, canteen open after labour details return, Sundays abbreviated hours. Lieselotte read the lines twice, then a third time to hear their rhythm. Schedule, labour, reward. She had joined to be useful and become a relay in a system that lost shape. Here, use returned as a verb with weight. If she named her skill right, perhaps the day would keep her busy enough to outpace memory. By afternoon, the first work rosters took shape. Farm, 6 women and 2 guards. Kitchen, 4 women, 1 cook, 1 mess sergeant. Sanitation, 2. Wire, 2. The engineer lieutenant asked for experience coiling field cable, and Lieselotte's hand rose. Spool capacity, insulation checks, tie-offs, she said in a voice that sounded like a younger sister of the one she had used in the signal hut. The lieutenant checked her name and told Ruth to issue gloves so the work would not punish good intentions. Ruth translated everything into the same grammar. The notice boards were the human version of a talk setting. No haggling, no pleading, no bargaining, except inside the notions of time and strength. The point of a rule was not to sound brave, but to stay true when you were tired. She had watched convoys outrun fatigue with checklists. So would this place. At evening mess, a kitchen line fed bowls in an even rhythm. The soup was thick, the bread soft, the meat modest. Ruth ate standing and listened for trouble. Raised voices, clumped feet, the hollow ring of a can hitting ground. She heard spoons, low talk, a laugh that surprised its owner. The sign came back into her head as she washed her tin with sand and a trickle from a water can. Rations equivalent to depot troops, the text had said. Not more, not less, just equivalent. She knew the number. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners in US custody, hundreds of camps, and that for the system to work here, it had to work there without breaking rhythm. Lights climbed the poles and hummed. MPs made their round like clock hands. The quartermaster man rolled his empty crates into a comb that pleased him, then took a last look at the stacks as if geometry could prevent errors. Lieselotte walked to the fence and watched the ditch fill with frog sound. She understood the trick. Law did not need to be loud if it could be certain. She closed her eyes and let certainty wash through her like supper. In the morning she would see if the schedule would keep her busy. Steam blew from the valve on the siding and settled like a sigh along the gravel. The train had come late, as trains did now that timetables shared space with surrender, but it came. Boxcars shuddered, doors rolled back, and men climbed out under watchful carbines. Word arrived like weather, felt before understood. They spoke of camps far away, of fences like these, of rules like these, and of a canteen where a man had once bought ice cream and Coca-Cola at the same counter. Lieselotte stood with cable over her shoulder, the rubber clean on her sleeve. She believed the story because belief was the only maintenance left. A German at Fort Lewis, Washington, had earned camp coupons for labour and had walked to a PX window and had faced a choice between sweets and a cold bottle and had chosen both. She imagined the bottle sweating in that man's hand while spruce trees whispered above barracks roofs. Joe came down from the warehouse with a clipboard and a temper practised into patience. He liked rail days because logistics sang in mass. "Inbound," he said to Morales, and Morales nodded and eased men toward the processing lines. "We'll send 30 cases to the canteen, 40 to the mess, and hold the rest for the farm details." He said it as a note to himself and the yard. Numbers behaved best spoken out loud. Ruth met a Red Cross colleague with inspection notes. "Same rules hold," the woman said, and Ruth nodded because rules travel. Parity rations posted, canteen access, coupon pay in place. They traded small talk about clinics and kitchens, then about bottling trucks, then the thing that made them smile, that the price stayed a nickel no matter how many borders a crate crossed, because the promise was part of morale. What spread was arithmetic so large it sounded like fiction. Hundreds of camps, they said, and near 500,000 Germans under US guard across the ocean. By 1945, 60-plus bottling plants, some said 64, spun out cap-hissing sweetness. Through the PX system, Coca-Cola held about 95% of soft drink share among US forces overseas. Billions of servings moved with the armies. And a nickel could cross an ocean and still be a nickel when it met a prisoner's hand. Morales watched faces take in that number and failed to place it inside anything they had known. He had learned in the Pacific that numbers could be weapons, ranges, charges, time on target, and here he saw their help. If even prisoners were in the budget, what did that say about the ceiling? He adjusted his sling and moved along the wire. The depot's day flexed for the train's mass. Joe cut pallets, restacked slumped columns, and had the forklift driver redo a sloppy turn. He sketched needs: mess flour, canteen bottles, farm salt and soap. He could feel the road behind the rail, convoy intervals, Bailey bridges, stateside factories dropping parts like punctual rain. Sometimes he liked the beauty of it, like a hymn in a practical church. Annalisa came with rolls and a note from the Burgermeister, asking for more farm hands for haying. Ruth translated. Joe said yes if schedules stayed honest. Morales said yes if supervision stayed tight. The answer looked like goodwill, but was math. Labour to calories, calories to quiet. Lieselotte listened and understood she had become a variable in an equation she did not mind solving. The train hissed into background noise. Men were in lines, boxes on dollies. The canteen window brightened. The first bottles of the afternoon went across the counter with a small metallic benediction. A POW from the train paused to ask if he could trade 2 chocolate squares for a third bottle. The corporal shook his head and pointed to the limit sign. The man nodded, smiled a little, and put 1 square back without sulk. Rules worked better than speeches when schedules could be trusted. Lieselotte finished coiling cable and took her coupons to the window. "Hamburger?" Ruth asked. "And a bottle," Lieselotte said, as if the words were a password to a more durable world. She stood aside and let the man from the train take his turn. He swallowed and blinked and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand in the universal gesture of a person being led toward a future by a taste that cannot be argued with. Later, when the yard had quieted and the frogs had found their voices and the floodlights began their faint evening hum, Joe walked the platform and wrote a few last numbers in a palm notebook. 30 cases to the canteen, 40 to the mess, 20 held for morning. He added a note about soap and a reminder to check a tire later. He closed the book and listened to a night where the loudest thing was order. He thought of miles, of crates, and of a nickel that stayed a nickel tomorrow because a system had decided it would be so. The gate swung on its pipe hinge with a noise like a cough held politely in a hand. The work detail stepped through in pairs, boots scuffing the crushed stone into powder that would cling to cuffs all day. Lieselotte shouldered the coil of field cable because habit made it easier to carry than to see someone else carry it wrong. Morales checked his watch, said nothing, and fell in with the unshowy calm of a man who understood that quiet guarded more effectively than volume. The CCKW idled by the ditch, a dark green metronome keeping time for a day built from instructions. The farm road cut through beet rows neat as bootlaces. Annalisa met them with a nod and a kerchief tight as doctrine, her palms flowered not from bread this time, but from dust lifted by wind. The guard posted his stop line with a glance and a boot heel. Lieselotte's detail joined locals already bent to the morning. Work needed no translation. The beats came from the ground with a wet sigh and a smell that was almost sugar. They thumped into baskets and made a rhythm of their own. The sun lifted, found metal to warm, and laid a gloss across Morales's receiver. Ruth arrived with a clipboard and a zinc canteen slung like a purse, translating the day into coupons before anyone could argue with fatigue. She held up the rate, 80 cents in camp script for the shift, and the limit sheet for the canteen. The rules, read out loud, turned hopeful into real. Annalisa distributed gloves mended at least twice, nodding her thanks to the army for making spare leather more common than spare anger. "Water at the truck," Morales said, and a woman from the village looked surprised by the small softness in his tone. The engineer lieutenant wanted 2 coils laid to the far hedgerow to bring a field phone alive on the hill. Lieselotte volunteered because wire felt like work she could do cleanly. The lieutenant talked in the discipline of distances and impedances. The words leaned on facts rather than ego. She liked him for it. He showed her how to loop a service bend through a fence post so the strain would go into wood, not copper. They laid the line, tested with a crank that made a chuckle in the handset, and marked the route on a card that would be filed and found again. By midday, the beats stood in tidy pyramids, and the CCKW's tailgate took their weight without remark. The cook sent out stew in lidded tins, and the smell of onions and marrow went around like a good rumour. Ruth cut rolls, put chocolate squares on waxed paper, and told a young prisoner, too thin, too pale, to sit before he fell down on his intention to keep standing. He obeyed with the shy gratitude of someone who has not been allowed to be ordinary for a while. A farmer's boy pointed at the truck and asked how far it could go. Joe, arriving in a smaller runabout to check inventories, said the manual liked £5,000 and a range sufficient to make a day's promises and return, but that the real answer was, as far as the schedule is honest. The boy nodded as if that were a story in need of a better title. Joe patted the sideboard and confirmed delivery: salt, soap, bottles, flour. He signed twice because copies made the truth reproducible. In the afternoon, wind rose and made the grass speak the way a field phone speaks when a storm steps on the line. Lieselotte walked the route they had strung and found a branch rubbing insulation. She moved it, tied it back, and felt the small pride that comes when your hands solve what your hands discover. She returned to the rows and saw that work had settled into cadence. The guards' faces changed shape when shifts found rhythm. Eyes went from staccato to legato. People seldom ran away from predictability. When the CCKW topped off its water from a can with a funnel shaped by a tinsmith long dead, the radiator cap made a burp that sounded like approval. Annalise laughed and said the truck had the manners of a draft horse. Joe said the trucks had numbers instead of names because numbers didn't argue when the time came to move. She shrugged. He was not wrong. Toward evening, Morales checked straps twice, then a third time because Miles respected caution. The convoy back to camp was only one truck long, but the rules did not care about scale. At the gate, he counted heads and said, "Good work," as if the phrase belonged on a rack between halt and pass. Coupons were issued, tallied, initialed. The canteen opened a few minutes early because Ruth had learned that mercy gets more interest when it arrives on time. The day closed like a ledger reconciled to the penny. Beats weighed, wire tightened, coupons earned, bottles exchanged. Lieselotte washed her hands at the spigot and watched the water carry soil away like a story that had decided to leave on its own power. Back under the lights, the fence hummed with insects, and the flood lamps found their steady note. She tasted stew in her teeth and coke on her tongue and thought how work, properly arranged, could turn surrender into something quieter than shame. The warehouse loafed across the yard like a low ship. Line-marked floors turned into lanes that taught pallets how to behave. Joe liked to be inside just after first light, when the place held its breath between night and the first forklift cough. He walked the aisles with his clipboard and the church-like urge to check that each stack stood square on its chalk rectangle. The air tasted of rope and paper and dried orange peel, a bouquet made by a nation that had decided to outthink scarcity. He began with returns, because mistakes compound if you let them sit. Bottles came back in block dividers, crowns dented into shallow smiles that told you how many times a cap lifter had kept its promise. He checked breakage rates and found them within tolerance. Glass failed all over the world at about the same speed, but care slowed the loss to something a ledger could forgive. He chalked a note, "More separators," and tucked the nub behind his ear. A bottling truck eased in with the patient grace of a barge. Stainless tanks caught light. Coils slept along the side like tamed snakes. The driver hung his hose, bled air, and made the yard smell faintly of syrup. Ruth came to the dock with a requisition handwritten in careful letters, and Joe initialed it because requisitions were the grammar of trust. "We're within limits," he said, and she smiled in the way people do when rules and needs fit without bruising. He walked the PX side and counted chocolate by the box, soap by the crate, paper goods by the sleeve. FIFO, he told the new man, first in, first out, because even generosity needs a method. He traced the path a bun would take from mill to truck to mess to the hand that would steady it under a patty. He liked the way the steps linked. Factory, rail, truck, hand, mouth, silence, the sound of a satisfied swallow. Strategy you could taste. Morales stopped by to ask about replacement brooms, and Joe pointed to a bin because the dignity of clean floors was part of the order. "You'll get better behaviour when spills don't get to stay," he said, and Morales nodded as if this were a kind of patrolling. Annalisa appeared with a ledger of her own, asking if flour could be set aside for tomorrow's bread. Joe did a quick turn through allocations, thought about the mess chart and the canteen board, and said yes without stealing from any promised plates. Trucks came and went. Some wore the dust of a day, some wore the shine of a check. Joe preferred the middle look, systems that announced their use without threatening failure. He put a hand on a sideboard and felt the cool under the heat and the strength under the paint. Standardization held the country together in invisible ways, parts fitting parts, crates fitting trucks, schedules fitting days. Even the cap lifters were the same shape from dock to front line to canteen nail, and sameness at scale felt like mercy. He took a moment to tell a new corporal why the aisles had to stay true. Because a sloppy stack becomes a broken stack, becomes a late stack, becomes a hungry man, he said. The corporal, who had been a grocer's son, nodded like he'd been waiting for someone to confirm that his father's rules counted out here too. They walked the aisle together and fixed a lazy pallet by leaning their weight just so until geometry agreed to cooperate. By midday, the dock rattled in a confidence that felt like muscle memory. Joe signed for a load of buns, then for a load of soap, then for a cart of crowns with the date stamped into each cap like a little oath. Ruth returned with empties, less a customer than a partner. She talked through canteen caps to keep barter sane and morale high. "Limits are kindness we can defend," she said, and he wrote the sentence in the margin of his book because it belonged next to numbers. Afternoon reached into the high windows and made dust look like gold. Joe took inventory of facts he trusted. The quartermaster had accepted roughly 518,000 CCKWS, and that number meant the country could put a truck under a promise almost anywhere it chose. The bottling plants by 45 numbered in the dozens, enough to keep a nickel drink honest. PX demand could be forecast to within a whisper if you counted work details and weather. He loved these things, not because they were big, but because they were exact. He finished with a walkthrough of the mess side, where sacks of flour leaned like obedient soldiers and tins of meat stacked to shoulder height held the day at the right distance from hunger. He checked a thermometer, tapped a gauge, and adjusted a strap. Outside, the forklift sighed down, and the driver rubbed his neck with the heel of a hand. The last crate of the shift slid into place with a wooden hush. Joe capped his pencil and put it in his pocket like a small victory. The empire of crates held. Tomorrow it would hold again because today had taught it how. The bread came out with a crackle under the cloth, crust blistered just enough to look like the surface of a lake when the wind changes its mind. Annalisa tapped the bottom of a loaf, heard the right drum, and smiled with authority older than any pamphlet. She sliced, set the pieces on a board, and passed them over the counter with a nod that meant more than please. Liselotte stood beside her with forearms dusted in flour and the quiet satisfaction of work that made sense at every step. Ruth turned the cap lifter and made the now familiar hiss a punctuation mark between sentences of the day. She had learned to place the chocolate square on the paper as if it were both receipt and benediction. "Limits posted," she said with the gentle firmness of a conductor tapping a watch crystal. The POW from yesterday's train returned to the window and accepted the rule with a shrug that had relaxed into habit. Habits were the quiet victories that didn't make reports. Morales walked the perimeter, boots whispering in the gravel, eyes touching faces long enough to register calm. He had seen how anger and hunger metabolized each other. Here, the schedule starved both. He paused by the gate to watch Joe wheel a cart of empties back to the dock and felt the ordinary magic of systems that did not need a speech to keep solemn promises. The guard shifted his weight and listened to the power poles hum like patient choirs. Liselotte asked Annalisa about stretching flour with potatoes, learned to feel the dough's readiness not by recipe, but by spring, and then showed a small trick with cordage so a sack could be rigged and carried by one person without burning the palms. Exchange travelled faster than rumours when it touched the hand. The older woman watched the knot tighten and loosen cleanly and said, "You were a signals girl. Of course you tie words that way." A list of impossible-seeming facts kept running beneath the surface of the day. To Liselotte, the numbers looked like tall tales told by precise people. By 1945, there were 60-plus overseas bottling plants. The PX system carried a soft drink that held roughly 95% share among US forces overseas. and billions of servings had moved with the armies. She did not argue with the arithmetic because she had tasted its conclusion. One camp's afternoon, 30 cases to the canteen, 40 to the mess, looked small until you laid it beside the road maps and counted trucks the way you count stars while pretending you're only checking the weather. Ruth noticed how the smaller mercies multiplied quietly. A bar of soap exchanged without fuss at the window meant fewer quarrels at the pump. A firm limit on chocolate meant less shadow trading at the fence. A bottle priced the same as in a PX meant no one had to explain why a prisoner's nickel bought less than a private's. She had learned that fairness could be policed with a ledger if the ledger was backed by warehouses that didn't lie. Joe wrote in his book that tomorrow's delivery could slip 1 hour without pinching any promise. He glanced at the forklift driver's posture and sent him to sit a minute and drink water because a turned ankle could wreck a schedule more surely than a miscount. Detail was not fussy. Detail was the most humane way to keep big things gentle. He thought of the factories that fed this quiet, assembly lines where cap lifters, crowns, separators, paper cups and bun sleeves rolled out like notes from a player piano. The afternoon cooled, and the frogs in the ditch found a key they all liked. Morales walked past the canteen and caught a word in Bavarian that meant decent, the kind of praise soldiers valued more than poetry. He kept his eyes open because praise created inattention, but he allowed himself one small gladness, that his quiet had become contagious. He checked his carbine's sling, habit checking habit, and moved on. As the line thinned, Lieselotte took her bottle to the step and watched dust settle back into itself. She had not changed flags in her head. Allegiance was not something a drink could edit, but she had started keeping a private tally of truths that refused to be shouted down. The system here did not swagger. It ticked. It did not ask her to like it. It asked her to show up, to work, to follow rules that never came as a surprise. She could respect that, as she had once respected a well-run net. Evening gathered, steady as routine. The last cap came off with the last customer, and Ruth hung the lifter on its nail so it could sleep vertical. Joe stacked empties into a geometry that would travel, chalked the count on the side, and let his hand rest there a moment, as if something in the wood could read gratitude. Small mercies had lengthened the day without wearing it out. Somewhere, in a ledger 1,000 miles away, it would look like nothing at all, which is how victory prefers to be written when it wants to last. The office door made an obedient chalkboard, paint dulled by years of palms and pencils. Joe sketched lines across the theatre map in strokes thick enough to be seen at a glance, thin enough not to look like boasting. He anchored strings with map pins whose heads gleamed like signals in a dusk patrol. Ruth stood with a notebook. Morales leaned a shoulder to the jam. Lieselotte hovered in the hall and listened because the numbers, explained, felt less like thunder and more like weather. "Here," Joe said, tapping a port's name, "is where the Liberty ships cough cargo onto rails. Here, the depots belly up to the sidings. Here, the convoys pick it up and put it down on time." He wrote a figure and let it sit. Roughly 518,000 CCKW trucks accepted by the Army, enough to put wheels under promises in Tidewater, Hedgerow and Alpen Pass. "That's not to brag," he added. "That's to say, we can keep a nickel out here because a country keeps its word in factories." He chalked another number. Camps into the hundreds, German prisoners in US custody measured in the hundreds of thousands. The line he drew from the warehouses to the canteen was as straight as a parade ground. "Rations are law," Ruth said, pointing to the Geneva notice they had taped to the wall beside the map. Depot equivalents meant calories were counted, fats bumped on need, sugar brought forward when morale sagged. "We check," she said. "We don't guess." He marked the bottling plants, those practical shrines to morale set up near rail and water. "By 45, dozens," he said, 60 plus, the number settling around 64 in the better briefings. Through the PX system, Coca-Cola held roughly 95% of the soft drinks poured for US troops overseas. A taste you can depend on, Ruth said, and let the sentence be both consumer slogan and operational truth. Morales raised a palm to add what the numbers did to people. Presence, he said, regular, predictable. You can feel trouble brewing like weather. This kind of order changes the forecast. He spoke like a man measuring wind, not giving a speech. He had used his quiet to bend days towards sense, and the system met him more than halfway. Lieselotte watched the chalk dust gather on Joe's fingertips and thought how the arithmetic translated into small things a prisoner could touch. Soap without bargaining, bread without shame, a bottle without a story with teeth inside it. She had read many maps in huts loud with voices trying to make the lines do what they wanted. This map looked like what they would do anyway. She caught herself using we and did not scold the pronoun for treachery. Joe went on slower now, as if the figures asked for reverence. Billions of servings had travelled with the armies, numbers large enough to flatten into noise until you held a single cold bottle and felt the thrum of arithmetic in your palm. He drew a little square over the canteen and wrote 5 cents above it. "Morale isn't a song you play once," he said. "It's a tempo you keep." They talked failure modes because honesty kept systems honest. A missed convoy cracked temper, a broken crown cost 2 minutes at the window, a sloppy pallet bruised a day. Ruth had learned to file reports that counted near misses as carefully as successes. Morales had learned to hear argument in footsteps 20 paces away and put himself there before the syllables sharpened. Lieselotte knew that wire, routed cleanly, saved you from hunting noise when the storm came. When the board held more chalk than paint, Joe stepped back. The map did not look like triumph. It looked like competence, and competence had carried this army over rivers and through months without wearing out its feet. He wiped his fingers on a rag that smelled of cratewood and wax and wrote the day's local numbers in the corner. 30 cases canteen, 40 mess, 20 held. The micro tethered to the macro like a lashings line. The room hummed with the kind of silence that follows comprehension. Ruth closed her notebook and said she would walk the canteen hour changes to the board. Morales said he would cut one post and strengthen another where 2 paths crossed. Lieselotte, surprising herself, asked if she could help audit bottle returns to see if the blocks needed replacing. "That's the spirit," Joe said, and slashed a checkmark on the margin like approval in handwriting. They stepped into the yard under a sky that remembered its promise of clear weather. The forklift dozed, the CCKW gleamed in a way only well-used things do. The fence threw a shadow that looked less like a boundary and more like a line on a well-drawn plan. They walked their separate duties with a shared word in their mouths that none of them spoke because it would have sounded like bragging. The word was enough. Lieselotte wrote at the mess table after lights out, the paper warmed by her forearms, a cap turned upside down to hold the curl in the corner. She wrote as if a letter could be sent, not to any address she would confess to Ruth, but to a future that might hold it without laughing. The pen worked the way a well-maintained rifle works, smooth, unhurried, precise. "We were fed as they feed their own," she wrote in a line that felt like stepping over water on stones you could trust. She did not recant the past. Loyalty has its own grave goods, and she would not strip them to pay for supper. But she began to list the small true things that had piled up until their weight tipped the day. Rations posted in 2 languages and kept to the ounce. Coupons for labour that bought soap, a chocolate square, an 8-ounce bottle whose taste detonated in the mouth like weather changing. A guard who said good work with the same tone he used for halt, as if the phrases had been polished on the same cloth. A truck that came when the schedule said it would, as if Miles themselves had signed the Geneva Articles. Annalisa kneaded dough by candle and listened to frogs and distant engines. She measured time by rise and knock, heat and hollow sound. The first harvest without sirens demanded hands more than speeches, and the POW details made the work go clean. She found that taking money in Allied scrip did not pinch pride the way she had feared. Money spends where bread is real. She thought how scarcity trains the ear to hear threats, and how routine can teach it to hear promises without cringing. Morales walked the line with his carbine sleeping against his shoulder and told himself he would not become sentimental. Sentiment, like neglect, was a troublemaker in uniform. But he allowed himself one thought, that the war had been lost for some men the first time they had to measure American order rather than imagine it. He had seen it at a bridge, Bailey panels flying together faster than anyone thought possible, and here, in a canteen line where a nickel meant the same thing as anywhere else on Earth. The predictability could feel more absolute than force. Ruth filed her last report of the day with the neatness of someone who believes paper can hold people together. She noted no violations, adjusted canteen hours for the farm crew, and requested more separators to cut breakage. She added a line that would never make a headline. Morale steady, fairness perceived as normal. It was the sentence she wanted to write on peacetime someday, because peace needed the same tools, parity, schedule, the soft tongue of a cap lifted clean. Liselott ended her letter with an image rather than a plea. The first hiss of the bottle, the first sip, the prickle on the tongue, the cold glass sweating into palm lines, the bun's white crumb, the patty's salt, the sense that defeat did not require humiliation if the victor believed in law more than spectacle. She folded the sheet and tucked it under the cap to weigh the paper until morning. She had started the day counting exits. She ended it counting things that had arrived as promised. Before lights fully died, Joe stood in the dark of the warehouse and listened to the building's sleep. Wood settled in warmth, ropes remembered tension and relaxed, glass pinged as it gave up heat. He rested a hand on a stack and thought about the scale that hid inside modest numbers. He pictured a stateside line spearing caps onto crowns in a rhythm no poet would write a sonnet about, and decided the poem existed anyway, in the fact of it repeating on time, without quarrel, across months. If this was how a nation chose to keep its word, then it had chosen the most grown-up kind of victory. The frogs got louder and then evened out. The power poles hummed their calm. The floodlights made a halo of dust around each moth. Morales met the relief at the turnbuckle, passed a quiet word, and handed over his patch of earth. Ruth pulled her blanket tight and told her tired feet that they had walked the right miles. Annalise closed the shop door and set tomorrow's flour to wait. Liselott lay on her bunk with her hand on the bottle cap in her pocket, proof small enough to carry and heavy enough to hold a mind steady. Somewhere a clock nudged midnight. The day rolled over without a jerk. Morning laid a quiet hand on the camp, a touch that felt like a blessing rather than a checkpoint. The crates waited in their geometry, the notice boards kept their tone, the CCKW breathed patience through a seam in its hood. Ruth unlocked the canteen, lifted the cap lifter from its nail, and felt the simple weight of a tool that had become a kind of ceremony. Joe arrived with a small cart, 2 stacks of crowns, and a grin of professional satisfaction that said the schedule had held again and would hold after him. Morales walked the perimeter with the steady gait of a man who refuses to teach the ground bad habits. Liselotte paused at the board before joining the wire detail. She touched the edge of the Geneva posting like someone rehearsing a creed, not of conversion, but of comprehension. Rations equivalent, canteen installed, purchases limited reasonably, payment in coupons for work rendered. She had tested each line and found it stubbornly true. Annalisa appeared at the gate with 2 baskets lined in cloth and asked, without embarrassment, whether she could leave a tally for flour against tomorrow's scrip. Joe said yes, because the ledger had already made room. They stood a minute as if it were a photograph. Behind them, the map on the office door held its strings, ports coughing up cargo, rails coughing it inland, roads coughing it into hands. The statistics were still absurd to a mind trained in shortage. Roughly 518,000 CCKW trucks accepted, bottling plants by 45 numbering into the 60s, a PX monopoly of taste that reached roughly 95% of overseas soft drinks for US troops, billions of servings riding the same arteries as ammunition, and yet the absurdity had resolved into the taste of a cold bottle that cost a nickel wherever a private might stand, and by rule, wherever a prisoner might stand behind wire. Joe said it softly, more to the morning than to the people. We made mercy affordable. It was a sentence he would not dare to put in a report, but saying it out loud once felt like paying respects. He thought of the men who had driven nights to keep it true, of hands that had turned wrenches and crowed caps without applause, and of accountants who had balanced temple and table so the nickel stayed the same nickel when it crossed an ocean. Morales nodded at nothing in particular, which was his way of agreement. He had learned to trust the quiet more than the shout. He would be rotated home in time, and he suspected he would miss the hum of floodlights, the predictable knock of empties, the clink and hiss of caps like distant church bells. He believed the war had been won by rifles and by rails, by courage and by crates, and he had carried both kinds of weight with equal care. Ruth wrote one last new line on the board, not because policy changed, but because comfort notices people who notice it back. Canteen closes 5 minutes early tonight for inventory. Ice cream when available. She underlined nothing. Authority did not need makeup when supply kept its face clean. She handed a bottle over the counter to Liselott, who took it with the uncomplicated thanks of someone determined to look facts in the eye and not blink. Annalisa left the baskets and a note in her tidy hand. She would have said, if asked, that victory often tasted like bread you were allowed to bake without fear and paid for without shame, and like a bottle cold enough to make your teeth ache. She walked back toward the village and saw that the road's shoulder had taken on the dry polish that meant trucks had passed so often the earth had learned discipline. Liselott coiled wire at the perimeter, eyes steady on her hands, and let the cap in her pocket press a circle against her hip. She could not say she loved any of this. Love in wartime often came dressed as lying, but she respected it, and respect builds bridges that speeches can only point at. She would go home when the papers allowed, carry a memory of a bun and a bottle into kitchens where stories might clash, and she would tell it anyway, that a guard said, "Good work," that the cook kept the range clean, that the price remained a nickel because someone far away had insisted that promises travel as well as trucks. The sun climbed, the crates held. The caplifter took another day's weight without bending. Joe pushed his cart into the shadow. Morales saluted in his barely there way. Ruth changed out the empty for the full with the grace of a dancer who knows the steps and the reason they matter. The impossible had become ordinary because a free people had decided that order would be their loudest argument. The bottle hissed once more, a small sound, and yet grand enough to close a war inside the human mouth and let the taste of victory be sweetness that even a prisoner understood could not have been faked.